from last week, and then I figured we could have some time just to review. We'll take a look back at the first 4 chapters. We'll be about a third of the way through the book, and so I thought it might be a fitting time to kind of just take a review and take a pause and say, hey, are we understanding this? Is this good? Is there any lingering questions? So I didn't prepare you for that, so if you have any lingering questions that you've had, any kind of challenges that are still in your mind, get those ready for the end of class, and we'll have a time to discuss those together and hopefully get to a better place with those. That being said, I didn't choose this section of 3:16. All right. I didn't choose this section of 3:16 through 4:16 arbitrarily, or because I wanted to just not do the chapters. I do think there is a topical connection with this section of Ecclesiastes. We talked a little bit about chapter 3 last week, and we'll breeze through some of these questions. But do you remember, did some of you answer this question, write a little summary? What's some of the overarching ideas going on in Ecclesiastes 3:16 through 4:16? Yeah, so man should enjoy his labor. That's one of the overarching themes of the whole book, too. So when you see it pop up, you're like, yeah, we need to pay attention to that. That's a good reminder. Thank you, Kim. Anything else? Anybody else get a summary of these sections? Yeah, there's a lot of that, right? I mean, you can see it in probably the headings of your Bibles that that's a big part of this section. But one of the things that ties, the reason I want to put this section together is because there's a few sections in chapter 3 and chapter 4 about the oppression and injustice and wickedness in the world. And it's like, that's one of the things you learn pretty quick. I think most of the protesters you see in the world are young people, and so it's one of the things we learn very quickly. Middle to early teenage years, we're like, none of this is right. It all needs to burn. We need to change it all. And there's a reason for that, because largely you could say that about basically anything in this world, because it's all spoilt and cursed by sin and sinful people, unfortunately. And we don't want to belittle that or overlook that, but it is true. And so Ecclesiastes takes a good look at that and says, yeah, that's how it is. If you're seeing that, you're not just you're not just an Eeyore. That's actually true. So it's good to be validated on that, I think. Good. Anything else in kind of the summary or overarching ideas of this section? Good. I don't want to retread too much of the ground we covered last time. We did talk about these. I keep forgetting this is not working. We did cover a few of these questions already. Basically, we got through chapter 3. But I want to draw your attention to this. Read with me in Ecclesiastes 3:16. The preacher says, moreover, I saw, not me, the preacher of Ecclesiastes, Koheleth says, moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. And in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. So what's the observation that he makes? It's just what we've been talking about, right? Where there should be righteousness and justice, what is there? Wickedness. Yeah, he doesn't mince words, does he? He's not like, hey, things aren't really that good. It's wicked. It's evil. It's abominable. It's kind of the thought here. And this leads him to thoughts about God and his judgment. And it led him to this dark place. And this is where we ended class, and I thought this would be a good place to start. Look at Ecclesiastes 3. I'll just read through the rest of the chapter, but I want us to pay attention to the last few verses of the chapter. So picking up where we left off in verse 17. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? So, again, paying attention to these, they kind of, really through verse 22, I should have typed up here. Really that observation that ends in verse 21, is this a true observation? When he says, the beast and man were all the same? Who knows if the spirit of man goes up and the spirit of the beast goes down? Is this true? That's kind of his point. We don't know because we're all limited. Again, this book is tackling this phrase under the sun is one of the important phrases, but he's tackling a viewpoint that is limited by our horizons, right? And so in that sense, we have faith, right? And we might say, well, hey, Jesus Christ is, and he's my king, and I have faith. And we say, yes, amen, that's true. That's not what he's talking about, though. We still are limited by the horizons of this world. Todd, did you have your hand up? Okay. I'm not trying to goad you into a comment if you don't want to, but if you want to make a comment, that's fine too. No, yeah, so that's good. Any other thoughts with this? Is this observation true? Why does he say this? I know we ended class with this last time, but I wanted to start here and kind of ramp back into this section of Ecclesiastes.
He's talking about man's faith.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we didn't have a faith in God and so forth, what's life going to be like?
Yeah.
What can life be like? We should be happy with our jobs and so forth because the Lord has blessed us.
Sure. Yeah. And when the way this connects to his views of like the oppression, the injustice, is when he says there in I think it starts in verse 19, maybe a little earlier. Verse 18. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. Part of the reason in the preacher's mind here in Ecclesiastes, when he's trying to make sense, it's so absurd that God would let this happen. Why is every place of justice filled with wickedness? Every place where righteousness ought to be, why is it filled with wickedness? And when he questions that, his answer, his understanding, it seems like his best stab at is that God is testing the hearts of men, which I think is such a profound conclusion. I don't think, it is a very profound conclusion to come to. To understand that for some reason, because this is one of the greatest questions people have, why is everything so broken? How can evil exist on such a scale and God still say he's all loving and all knowing? And the preacher says God has big things going on in his mind, right? And part of this allowing, that's such a diminutive way to put it, by the way, but part of this allowing of this to go on is that he's testing us. Because we know a lot of times that everything's going great and everything's sailing along just like we want it to. How much do you learn in those times? How much do you think, like, hey, I guess I must have done something right. Everything's good. And I think maybe a part of the kind of instruction behind this conclusion is that the preacher knows that a lot of times we need this world to be so touched by brokenness and injustice and wickedness to remind ourselves that there really is a part of us that is just like the animals, that we can't change the grand scale of things. We can't change all this stuff. And really the conclusion, like you're pointing out, Les, that if we don't have faith, if we just have this secular worldview, that's not enough. It's just not a sufficient answer, right? Anything else about that? Go ahead, Pat, and then Dave.
It's sort of the same. If we don't have God and there is no judgment, then we are the same as the animals.
Yeah.
They're just done, they're done.
Yeah.
We would be done. But we know there is a God, and we are in his image, and that makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. And I think he's trying to build up to that point, even though he is tackling in a certain arena of thought. Dave?
So first I'll ask, do animals have a spirit? Yes or no?
They have a breath of life in them, but they don't have a spirit like we do, right?
Because what happens to the spirit of man when it dies? It returns to God. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting how, it's kind of like, it's almost like it's not pointing at a huge overall picture as much as when it says in 19, they all have the same breath. Mm-hmm. And man has no advantage over the beast for all his vanity. All go to one place. And what he's getting at is he's saying, y'all return to the dust. That's what's the same, is both go to the dust.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's pointing us again to death, right? That we're all marching towards this. And maybe the helpful thing about that is that animals generally have a shorter lifespan too.
The other part of that is you come across it time to time where people talk about, dogs in heaven. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like, well, forget dogs. A dog is an animal. So it's kind of like if the dog's going to heaven, that means everything else is going too.
Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, and that's not the point he's making, right? The point he's making is that, it's the other way around. This isn't answering like, hey, are they coming with us to heaven? This is asking, is anybody different than an animal? Or is anybody going to heaven? That's the question of this verse. And saying, who knows, right? And so but it's just trying to goad us into thinking about existence and all these kind of greater than questions. Rick, and then we'll move on to the next section.
There's one word that you mentioned while you was talking, and you said, is God testing? Mm-hmm. And we look over and back and forth from Genesis to Revelations, and God is always looking at his people. Mm-hmm. We should know better. Even if the preacher says vanity of vanities, all is vanity, we know better.
Yeah.
God is the beginning and the end. He knows everything. Just like Dave said, the animals are animals.
Yeah.
And even though when people lose their puppies and their doggies and everything, and they're grieving over the animal, it's still, a time to understand that God made the animal. So you think of it not necessarily he's going to heaven or any of that kind, because there's a separation. God made man to think.
Yeah.
And he's testing us. Are you thinking about what he has to say, or are you thinking about what man has to say?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that all these observations are true. Like, it's kind of this really interesting comparison and contrast. The overarching point he's trying to make is saying, hey, look, if this is it, like, again, all this is looking at the wickedness and unrighteousness going on, and the fact that God allows it is this test for our hearts to remind us of our smallness in the world. That's his point, that we are just like animals and how small we are. Like, we're pretty callous. I mean, you think about when Solomon dedicated the temple, you know how many animals died on that day? Have you read that section? Does anyone have a guess or remember that? This is Bible trivia, by the way, pop quiz. Thousands, 8,000, 10,000 of different types of animals. They just killed them. They were cut down in their prime, all right? And I think part of the point that the preacher is making, and he's making it very bluntly, but we kind of get sometimes distracted from it for whatever reason. He's saying, look, all of the difficulties and the sinfulness and the wickedness that exists in the places where it ought not is God's message to every person who has the heart and the eyes to see it, to say, listen, your life is short. This is, like, everything's broken. You're going to die just like everything else. And this reminder, he'll say later in chapter 7, is one we ought to take to heart, right? It's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. Better is the day of death than the day of birth. Whoa, that's a crazy thing to say, right? But the point is that the living take it to heart. And we need these reminders. And there's a whole lot of different conclusions going on to make that kind of same point. We do need to move on. I know you have comments, but we have to get into chapter 4. His solution is to enjoy the work we have to do and to kind of appreciate the blessings of it. But read with me. Can I actually get a volunteer to read Ecclesiastes 4, verses 1 through 8? Go ahead. Brett, how about you read it for us, please? Ecclesiastes 4, 1 through 8.
Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full with toil and grasping for the wind. Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, without companion, has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune.
Thank you, Brett. All right. So again, he's making all these just boom, boom, boom observations about life and the difficulties of life. And not just difficulties, but really just existence. How does the observation in chapter 4, verse 1 compare to the one we were just talking about in chapter 3:16? So again, 3:16, he said, in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. In the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. What observation does he make in chapter 4, verse 1? It's hopeless, right? Yeah, Brett said it's hopeless. What else? Like, how else would you put that? What does he say? There's all these oppressed. Like, there's so many people that are oppressed. And what's true of those people who are oppressed? What hope do they have of comfort? None. There's no comforter. This is, again, like, so how do you, when you compare these two observations, what's his overall worldview seem to be, in this section at least? Not good. There's a lot of pain. And again, we might ask, like, it's good to remind ourselves, don't get our head hung down too low in these sections, but if these are thoughts that just feel overly sad or overly depressed or too dark, then I need to push back, I think, and say maybe we aren't being realistic about how broken this world is. Christians, we do major in the hope and the blessings and the joy of the Spirit and the joy of our hope in Jesus Christ, and we always should. I'm never undervaluing that. But we can have that and also realize these things. And we need to. Because if we don't look into these dark crevices of life that is true for so many, we will have no drive or desire to save them, to save anybody who finds them in this place without hope. And so we have to see this and to see that there are so many oppressed, and the oppressed, their only hope is to have a relationship with their Maker. That's the only freedom and solution that they'll ever find. That was Jesus' heart, right? He came to set liberty to the captives. Anyway, so what conclusion does this observation lead the preacher to in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 4? What does he say? Yeah, better to be dead. I thought the dead who are dead, they're more fortunate than the living. And verse 3, what's even more fortunate than both of those people? Those who never lived. Man, that is tough. What do you think about that conclusion? Do you agree with him? It's true, right, in a sense. But what do you think about it? Like, how does is it just like, all right, he said it, so that's right? Is there any pause? Is there any kind of challenge with this as we wrestle with it? Go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, I thought that it's weird that as for men, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. It's like there's not even a challenge there. Like, I think it should have said, God's going to test you to make sure that you're not like the animals.
Yeah.
And then you go over there and it's like the comforter. I think that's interesting that he uses the word comforter, like there's no comforter yet, but Jesus is coming and he's the comforter.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with you. To all that I say amen, right? But again, like the perspective he's coming at is like he's talking to people in a worldview that has no God, right? A life under the sun. And so in that sense, when you do look at the oppression, there isn't a comforter. Even though by faith, we both know that Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit offer that comfort for everybody. But he's taking a look at it and saying, this is tough, right? This is really, really challenging. There's a lot of people, if you're just looking at it from a secularized worldview without God in it, it's a hard thing to look at. And it's a hard thing to really look at and to not come to the conclusion he comes to. Has anybody, maybe in a moment of somewhat melodrama, asked this question, like, why do I even exist? Why was I even born? I don't know if you've ever said that. I can foray into the melodramatic sometimes in my life. There have been times where I'm like, what am I even doing? Like, what is the point? And that's kind of the question, right? I mean, my faith answers that question very quickly every time, all right? Maybe not, various speeds, but somewhat quickly, I think. And I think this is what we're seeing is there is a void here. When you really pay attention and when your eyes are open to the oppressions of the world, it leads to these exact thoughts you were saying, Jennifer, right? Where we're like, there's got to be something. Like there is just a great need here. And again, why I think these reminders are so powerful and needed for us as Christians to look back on this is to remind ourselves that there are so many people in the world. This is the only answer they have without Jesus Christ. This is the only answer. This is the big question mark they have, right? Jennifer?
Then my question is, like, there is so much evil in the world. It is so shocking. I mean, everything he says here, it's like so are we even supposed to know about it? I mean, it gets so I'm like, okay, God, I'm just going to pray to you, and I'm not even going to know what's going on. I'm just going to go to my happy place and forget what's going on around me because it's too heavy.
Sure.
It's like, yeah, it could take the joy out of your life. And I mean, we don't want to go around glum all the time, but it could happen.
Yeah. I think that's such a great question to ask, looking at it from a Christian perspective. I think there's a couple things that I think about. Like, first of all, there is a choice with focus, right? Like, sometimes we can't. I'll answer this more with a second. The second point is we live in like a 24-hour news cycle too. That's kind of like all in your face, and now it comes with this expectation in our culture that you have to kind of be up on all of it. And I think that's not really. I think that's kind of a lie, personally. I think as much as you want to be up to it, that's good. But I think you're right that a lot of times, constantly be inundated with news from all over the world at every hour, every minute of the day, it's a lot to handle. And so I think that the idea of focus, like you're saying, and I think choosing in our walk with Christ to maybe turn down the noise a little bit and amplify and magnify our relationship in prayer with God is definitely something we ought to do to handle it and to not get overwhelmed by the hopelessness. But I think the challenge of these verses in Ecclesiastes also remind us that we can't turn a blind eye either. Because if we turn a blind eye or just put the blinders on and say, okay, well, I'm good, then I know you don't do this, but I'm just saying this is the challenge, right? We have to walk this middle ground where we have eyes open and hearts open and arms open to people who are in these positions. And we're not kind of oh, that's too bad. Jesus would be good for you. But no, we really understand the problems you're in. While also being not overtaken by the hopelessness that is talked about here. Does that make sense? And so I think there is, from a Christian, practical point of view in these verses, there is a balance to be struck. But I would say if these verses are too shocking or too depressing, then we need to remind ourselves that this is a reality as well. And we need to have eyes open to this so that we do understand how dire the situation is of this world. So I think his conclusion is severe, but it is true too. Les, you had a hand up, and I don't want to overlook it.
Well, I was going to say that all these questions that we get in Ecclesiastes are leading us to think about God. And we know he's in control of everything, but if we have faith in God, then this shouldn't concern us that much. It shouldn't worry us that much, I think. And you can go over to Romans 8 and verse 35, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? For the sake we face death all day long, we are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. And then it goes on to say that nothing can separate us from the love of God.
Amen.
And yet we see this, just like she was saying, we see this all around us. But if we are focused on God, we know we can get through this. He's going to help us get through this.
Yeah, I think this is the difficulty of Ecclesiastes, reading as Christians. It's like when people are discussing the story, a book you know the ending to, and they're like, I just don't know what's going to happen. What's going to happen with this character? I know what happens. This is the end. It's all going to be okay. You're going to love the ending, all right? But as we read Ecclesiastes, we kind of have to sit in the cliffhanger middle and say, yeah, but what would it be like if I didn't know the solution? If I didn't know that there was something beyond the horizons, above the sun, if I didn't know that, what would life be like? And that's the pain of this class as Christians. We were always itching to race to the finish line. No, there's Christ. And yes, I'm not ever going to, of course, downplay that. But this is the point he's making. This is why he writes the way he writes. He's writing in the Bible from a perspective of faith, but he's writing as a critic of saying, what would life be like if that wasn't the case? If we didn't know the end? And this is what, the challenge I think Christians have with reading this is it gets really depressing. We're man, this is, and it's a reminder, a constant reminder of life without God. I do want to keep moving forward. In this second half of this section he reads, verses 4 through 8, he highlights a few attitudes toward work. Did you notice them? And what attitudes are these? What are some of the attitudes you see highlighted about work in verses 4 through 8 of chapter 4? There's no end, right? Good. What else? What else do you see?
It's never satisfying.
Yeah, it never says no end. It's no satisfaction. Again, these are not surprising if you've been reading the first 3 chapters of Ecclesiastes. What else do you see? And then more specific even. There's something more specific like situational attitudes towards work. Daryl?
That you're envying somebody, that's why you do what you do.
Yeah, right. This is so, I think, just like he sums it up like that, so succinctly. And it's like most people who are working, this is what it is about, you know? Oh, my neighbor has that? How'd they get that? Oh, I guess I'll put in the overtime. I guess I need a promotion, whatever. Or they got praised by the boss. Oh, I need to get that praise. And, it's like we're all working out of envy, right? Good. What other attitudes towards work or surrounding work do you see in these verses? What does verse 5 say?
Well, I think it's talking about extremes. You can be really lazy or you can be really go for it and work too much.
Yeah.
I think the idea here is just to be satisfied with what you need and call it good.
Yeah. Verse 6, all right, so you highlighted two of the attitudes he portrays, right? Verse 5, like you said, highlights this laziness. The fool folds his hands, and what does that lead to? Starvation. He eats his own flesh. I mean, talk about a succinct, concise picture. It's like, well, I'm not going to be envious. I'm going to solve the envy problem, so I'm just going to be content with what I have. As in, I'm going to be content with nothing, and it's going to lead to my end. That's not right either, of course. You can't just be a poet and an artist and a dreamer your whole life. You have to work. And then verse 6, I think you were referencing this, Todd, possibly. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a moderation here. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil. How do you understand that? How would you rephrase that? And he puts it pretty perfectly. I like the poeticism here. I like the imagery. But how would you say that kind of in just like plain English? Satisfaction, right? It's a constant answer he's giving. Any other thoughts about that? Balance, good. Yeah, so he puts it in terms of handfuls, right? It's like how you can measure things. It's like a handful of quietness, then 2 hands full of toil. It's like you got to keep a hold of. John Knob and I were talking about this actually before class, like making time to. He's not here, so he can't speak, but he's in the back room. But he was talking about like playing tennis with his daughter and playing golf with the son, like doing all these things to spend time with the family. And like he's like, I was working hard at the beginning of the week so I can make time to do these things at the end of the week. And he didn't know this, I don't think. I didn't think about this in that moment, but this is like the perfect kind of highlighting of that attitude, right? I'm gonna work towards this handful of quietness, not out of envy for anybody else, not out of laziness so I can be complacent, but out of this attitude, I want to enjoy the family and the gifts I have right now. I'm going to work hard to make sure I can, but also I'm going to find balance in that, right? And this is like one of the things that Christianity and the gospel teaches in the New Testament over and over again. This is a common idea. But man, if you don't have a relationship with God, it can be hard to find that moderation, can't it? Even if you know it exists, even if you know, I want to find a middle ground. So often the problem isn't kind of a intellectual knowledge. Well, I know where I want to be. The problem is, how do I get there? And I think, again, Ecclesiastes points out that our labors speak, because toiling and working and laboring, it's a big theme in Ecclesiastes because it's a big theme in our lives. I mean, if you work 40 hours a week, how many hours of your life are spent working? Here's the answer, a lot. A lot of your life is spent working. And then that's not even accounting for the people who work more than that. The people who work weekends and all this, and then there's labor that you don't get paid for that you have to do at home. You have to make sure that the gutters aren't full and the house, the roof is pressure washed and the driveway, all this stuff. You have to take the trash out every so often. You have to keep working. And if we have a bad relationship with that work, that's a huge portion of our life. And so what the preacher is doing is not just saying, hey, here's some good attitudes to have, but rather I think what he's saying is saying, hey, what is your relationship with your work? Are you motivated out of envy? That's not going to be good for you. Are you a lazy bum? That's not going to be good for you either. You need to be able to grab on to the quietness and also grab on to the labor you have to do and find this moderation. But both these things will kind of illuminate and demonstrate that your work can't be all. You'll end up with nothing, right? And there's actually one more attitude, right? One more kind of situation in verses 7 and 8 he points out. What kind of instance involving or surrounding work does he point out in verses 7 and 8?
Can't leave anything down to heirs.
Yeah.
Like, you can't take your money with you, obviously, but you want to leave a legacy for your children, and this person doesn't have any relatives to leave anything to.
Yeah. And yet, what's he doing?
Working. Oops,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, so he's like, there's this idea where it's like this guy wants to work really hard to leave something for who? Have you ever seen this attitude? Someone who's working. It's like, what are you working so hard for? Like, we all are super impressed. Like we are very impressed with your work ethic, very impressed with the product of it. But dude, at some point you gotta ask, like, what? This is the question he asked, right? The person never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? And he says, I liked Brett's translation here, actually. He said, this is vanity and an unhappy business. I think Brett's translation said grave misfortune or something like that. The preacher's not mincing words here. Again, he's not just saying, hey, this isn't so good. He's saying this is like, it's an absurd kind of grand, divine mishap. It's a horrible fate. Because, work isn't, you should enjoy your work, but if work's everything you have, then you have a sad existence. That's what he's saying. I almost felt bad saying that, but then I realized that's exactly what he's saying. If work's all you have, that's a pitiable existence in life. And so many people, even Christians, kind of get this kind of fleshly or secular kind of view of life where we think, well, I got to work hard, but then it becomes its own God, its own kind of thing. And there's some people who are working so hard with nobody to even work for. You got to ask, what's the point? What's the benefit? Ricky, and then Les.
So I'm dealing with this retirement stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Worked hard, lots of hours, healing the kids, all, okay, she's gone now. So I'm struggling. Yeah, I can look at all my labors. I can look back and I can talk about it, and I can go see. I can go from the Navy base to Emerald Downs and all points in between, but it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And it says in verse 9, there two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor.
Yeah.
So when she was with me, she always reminded me of what this life is.
Yeah.
At the end was. And that's the point.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to say I got it, but when that other partner, Jan can attest to this, when that other partner that's been so encouraging, so loving, leaves this side of life, you're struggling night and day just to keep all this in perspective.
Yeah.
And you can know all the Bible that you want, but when you're alone and traveling. And I can't even explain to you what it's like. But the thing about it is God has a plan, and I have to knuckle down and knuckle under to his thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And try to keep motivated.
Yeah. And I think you're right. Like this does go right into the next section about two are better than one and all this, and like the support of relationships and the beauty that relationships bring, especially the marriage relationship, I believe, does kind of illuminate a lot of the hard edges of this question or this problem. Les, and then we'll move on to the next section.
I think verse 7 is another way of telling us to have a work-life balance kind of thing, too, because at the end of verse 7, whom am I toiling and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? Yeah. Enjoy your work, but give yourself some time for other enjoyment too, I guess.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, he's that's why he points out a few attitudes, a few perspectives on work, and he's reminding us like there's a lot of extremes in here, but you have to find the middle ground, and you have to be balanced. You have to work. You can't not work. There's some good English for you, but you also have to really be careful with your attitude towards it, because if it's all kind of consuming, then you're not well off. Look here in verse 9. As he finishes the section about the man who's working for nobody, verse 9 comes in with the opposite kind of side of the coin. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. So where does these section of verses find their application in life? In marriage, that's a great example, right? Where else might they find their application? The church. Good. Marriage, church, anywhere else?
Anti-isolation.
Anti-isolation, just in general, right? That's the overall idea of it, right? What are the specifics though? Like, Marriage, church, anywhere else? Like you can think of like specific instances of this being true? Hiking, right? Yeah, sure. Buddy system, right? Kim?
I was thinking of this in the context of toil and work.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, like, how much more enjoyable it is when you had, during a job, when you have somebody that you really enjoy being around. It doesn't matter what the job is, but if you have, good partnership with people in the office or something, it really elevates the toil that you have to do to, anyway, I guess I was thinking of it since it came right off the labor discussion, but.
Yeah, I think that it's like its truest kind of direct application. And it does, like, it definitely applies to marriage. Definitely, the church is a place where we labor and toil, right? So it definitely applies to the church. I've heard this phrase, it's not from God, so it's not perfectly true, but it is, a phrase that I think hits an idea. People don't quit jobs, they quit managers. We're like the people we work with and the people we work for define so much of our engagement with that work. And there are managers that make you feel like you're alone and you're the problem. If you don't get this done, then like, what's going on, And so like, this idea really does, I think this is about, and it is in the context of laboring and toiling. And it's right in the immediate context, someone who's laboring for nobody by himself and has no one to even remind him like, hey, why are you even doing this? Is this really worth all the work you're putting into it? And there's a lot of benefits that come. Yeah, I answered my own question. I forgot that I asked that question. But I think that's part of what's going on here.
I think it's also important to have friendships.
Yes. Yeah.
Relationships. We're built for relationships.
Amen.
And if we don't have them, we're in a sorry state.
Yeah. Yeah, Jesus had 12 friends, and among those he had 3 that he was really, really close with, it seems. And then there's people like Mary and Lazarus and Martha who he seemed to really love. If there was anybody who could have done it alone, though, it seems, it would have been Jesus, in a sense. But he had really rich relationships with people who would ultimately let him down, and he still hung around with them. I think that's pretty telling to us. Good. Let's read this last section, because I thought we'd have time to review, and we ended up just taking the whole time to talk about this chapter. Oh, go ahead.
With each of those friends, what was the one common thing he did? He ate with all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're alone or we feel like we're alone in life, go find somebody to eat with.
Yeah.
That's what Jesus did.
No, I agree. I love that call to hospitality and to making time for those things, getting out of your habits, I think that's really but yeah, and and to encourage each of us to be inviting more often. That's a reminder I know Haley and I talk about we need from time to time just to get on it. All right, let's finish up the chapter. Pick up here in verse 13. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and striving after the wind. Striving after wind. What is this section talking about? This is, I'll be straightforward with you, this is one of the hard sections of Ecclesiastes to translate. Because he's teaching wisdom by telling a specific story. It seems to have a specific point. But what does it sound like he's talking about as you read this section? Les?
Well, I got a headline here. It says advancement is meaningless.
Sure.
Or put another way, advancement without God is another example of the meaningless of secularism.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is the conclusion we can draw from definitely one of the salient conclusions. But it still leaves me with the question, what is the story itself about? What kind of story is he telling here to illustrate the point? Who is this youth and who's the old man and what happens to the youth at the end, does it seem? What did you say, Todd? Popularity, yeah. I kind of think this is what's going on here, is that there was this old man, and everyone's like, oh, he's out of touch. And so this young person comes up, right? Hope for the future, bright new ideas. Everyone's like, yeah, this guy's awesome. And then he gets old, and everyone's like, who's this guy? We need another young guy. And it's like, that's just, again, it leads to your conclusion, right? That no matter how far you advance, there is some vanity involved in it. But I also think it paints this picture of this restlessness of the world, the restless cycles that the preacher's talking about. Brett? Yeah, they'll never forget you until someone new comes along. That's exactly, I think, that's a good summation of this story, right? I mean, that, when you're a part of that movement with the new young person who's like, going to solve all the problems, like, this is it. Like, we're finding utopia, whatever it is. We found El Dorado. We find the solutions. And then the shine wears off, and you're like, oh, who's this old guy? When did he get here? It's the same guy who was before, but yet the same conclusion. And so there's this restlessness, and this, like he says, how does he end this section? Surely this also is vanity. It's absurd. It's mysterious. It's empty, and a striving after the wind, to constantly put our hope in these things. And so he kind of mixes in this section oppression and wickedness and injustice, but he also mixes it with ideas of toil and labor. And maybe a question to ponder is, why are those so mashed up together in this section? Is there, like injustice and stuff, like does that have and toil, these ideas, they hit us kind of where we live in a real sense, right? I mean, taxes are where those two things meet. Maybe you have problems with taxes and where your taxes go. I'm not trying to tell stories for you, but I'm just saying, as an example, there's all these things where you start to say, oh yeah, I do have opinions about that. And I don't I do kind of feel it grinds my gears. And I think what the preacher here is doing, Koheleth is doing in Ecclesiastes, is looking at it all and saying, is life just all about working and paying the bills and all of this? Is this everything that it's about? Just to labor when there's so much injustice? Even the money that I'm getting goes to this or that. What's the deal? And it's all vanity. And it leads us to that question that maybe chapter 3 pointed at. He's put eternity within us. All these things that the preacher is he drops little seeds and hints. And then the conclusion at the end of the book is going to be fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man, right? Cass, I'll let you get the last comment, then we'll be done.
This entire section reminds me of Mary sitting at Jesus' feet and Martha bustling about and trying to serve everyone and trying to be a good hostess. And Jesus pointing out, Mary has the right of it. There's no point in running around cleaning the house if you have Jesus to sit at.
Yeah. Yeah, the example of Mary and Martha is a good, I think, dichotomy for this. That's a great comment. All right, I appreciate you all. Next week we'll be in chapter 5. There's questions up here for chapter 5 through 6. That'll be for next week.